Welcome to Reinvent and the Reinvent the Humanities to Change the World series that we're doing in partnership with Georgetown University. I'm Pete Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, and I'm going to be conducting the interview today. And our interview today is with Tim Kobe. And Tim is the founder and CEO of 8 Inc. And 8 is, for many of you, you may not have heard of it. It's probably one of the most interesting companies you may never have heard about. But in certain circles, they're extremely well known. They are a strategic design firm, and they've got offices all over the world. In fact, Tim is with us coming in from Singapore today, where they have an office, but they have offices in Europe, they have throughout Asia, and as well as the United States here. And they've got, essentially, they work with very high-end firms around design issues. And one of their claims to fame, and it is truly a claim to fame, is they work Tim himself worked very closely and his company with Steve Jobs for a good dozen years before Steve died, and they essentially were the company that really came up with the idea, among many things, but came up with the idea and really executed the Apple retail stores, which at the time were really revolutionary, and many people thought they were going to completely fail, and in fact they've kind of revolutionized retail shopping in many respects. But among that and among others, and I also got many other kind of interesting clients that we're going to get into in the interview today. So, Tim, it is great to have you in the conversation here. Welcome.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here.
Well, how about, again, we're talking to a generalized audience here, and how would you describe your company and what you do, and kind of how do you explain the world of design actually to, let's say, outsiders of what is your business?
Yeah, I think, at our highest level, we're basically a strategic design firm, but that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. I think that what we try to focus on is creating human experience, and it's moved us away from the traditional silos of design, the typical verticals that you find in design, and our shift, for many years has been really on people and understanding the experience that you create for people through design. And I think that's probably the core of what we do. And it's a little unusual in terms of the approach and in terms of the outcome, but because it's so focused on the human outcome, it has I think consistently been a way of arriving at meaningful design.
Well, so just to unpack even just what you mean by design, because again, outsiders from the field, they might have a narrow view of it, but when you think of design, talk to us a little bit about what you mean and what the elements that go into that, because there's computer design, there's kind of urban design, there's
right.
design process, there's all kinds of ways that design is being used today. I'm just curious how you talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, so traditionally design has been thought of in these silos, in a way what you just described, where there's computer design, there's urban design, and they're fundamentally disciplines within a broader design category. But when you look at design at its most basic level, what you're doing is you're creating things for people, and the things that people remember, the things that are ultimately more meaningful for people, are things that have an impact on their lives, things that change what they're doing. And I think that we tend to take on projects that are outside of traditional disciplines. It's not to say that we don't have trained people within these verticals, but the idea of approaching a project from a category tends to limit really what you can do through design. And if you look at the Apple retail program, for example, there's a design of the retail program, but if you think of a higher level connection of Apple and its customers, the people that admire the brand, that connection is something that happens through a combination of things. As human beings, we are holistic creatures. We think of things in holistic ways, and that means that the environments, the products and services, the communications, the behavior, all of those things that go into the experience that Apple creates relative to its customers are conceived of together, that they're thought of as a holistic package, and that people tend to experience these things in many ways, but in a holistic approach that really delivers something distinct for Apple.
Interesting. So before we get into that, I'd love to get more into this Apple story here, but in a minute here. But so the kinds of people you've got, like a couple hundred people in your firm. Like what's their background? Where are they coming from? Like who is in this kind of who are you looking for? Who do you hire?
Right. We tend to find people who probably have, I mean, the traditional definition, I suppose, is kind of T-shaped learners. People who have a depth of a particular subject, but really have a broad knowledge base, and being able to, understand things both from essentially sort of a right brain and a left brain point of view. And I think the idea that there's a deep expertise is important, but on the other hand, we need people who can understand. I would say more around a higher emotional intelligence level than maybe the average person. And we try to get people who create an environment that through the collaboration you end up with something that's a little more maybe a little more animated, but also a little more distinct from a kind of a consistent framework. It's a bit of an alchemy as opposed to a science, I would say.
And so how, I mean, I could see where you could find people with that deep understanding, and how to essentially filter for that. But how do you filter for that broader kind of sensibility? Is there ways that you think about that?
Yeah, well, so I mean, if you look at many of the people that we have in the company, we've structured it in such a way that we really look for people who are maybe more outliers to a traditional path in a category. So we may have an architect who comes from a very very specific education around architecture, but we tend to look at what their other interests are and what are the other things that they may be participating in. So we have an architect who's also a professional bike racer and who does other things, who makes components. We tend to look at people who probably don't fit into the standard way of doing things, and as such, they tend to either move through other companies where it's kind of a cubicle lifestyle to find a nice fit with us, where it's more of a different culture, one that allows that difference to be elevated.
Well, given the theme of our kind of this series, does that often indicate some kind of exposure or interest in the humanities and arts and languages and philosophy and things that are associated with the humanities, or how does that figure into this?
Well, I think the humanities are essential. That if they don't have a fundamental understanding that everything they're doing is a reflection of our culture, if it's purely something that's around a discipline, then I think we typically don't have the best creative outcome. That if you look at many of the clients that we've had over the years have been people who have been incredibly strong, in exercising critical thinking as well as looking at empirical thinking. And I think that particularly today, there's an emphasis on the STEM and the kind of the development of the the sort of the more analytical way of thinking about things. But we haven't seen that in the most successful people. In the most successful people, we've actually seen an incredible balance between the ability to move from what we sort of consider right brain and left brain capabilities. And I think a lot of the humanities, having empathy for people doesn't come out of an analytical process. It tends to come from a different way of arriving at conclusions. And I think that as a result, that approach is essential for people to be successful within the design field.
Well, now, you made reference to some of your clients, and the most famous one being Steve, I would say. Why don't you just, people again who don't know your background or know your company, tell us a little story of how did you start getting involved with him, and just tell us a little bit about what, the interactions you've had with Apple over the years here.
Sure, sure. Well, Steve hired us when he came back to the company in 1997. Originally, we were hired to produce the Macworld events, so launching all of the Apple products. Um, we're starting our 19th year doing that this year. So we've been doing that with Apple for a very long time. A couple years into the work with Apple, I wrote a white paper on why they should do retail. We had just done work with Nike and the North Face, and Apple was experiencing a similar problem that both of those other companies had been experiencing, which is they were driving people to their retail channels because they had an aspirational brand, an aspirational attraction, but their products were being countersold at at retail. So the third-party resellers would tend to hand them off to either a cheaper product or a copy of the original product. So we started working in the retail program really from a whiteboard with Steve, and worked through that for many years. We met with him every week for 12 years until he became too ill to come to the company on a regular basis. But I think one of the most challenging things, that a lot of people have discussed what Steve was like as an individual and how difficult he may have been. But I think one of the interesting things that I saw over and over was he was very comfortable switching between looking at something from an analytical perspective, so almost to the point of being able to run through a logic tree and say, if this, then this, and he would always find where there was a problem. So he would first run through it from a logic perspective, and he would call out where there was a bust in that logic every time. In the event you made it through the logic tree, then he would switch over to the emotional side, and then he would look at it and think about it, and then sort of say, yeah, but it just doesn't feel right. And so it was very frustrating for people to work, because you were actually managing kind of both sides of this personality. But I think that's what gave him incredible strength and incredible vision was, the logic piece had to be right, but the emotional part had to be just as right.
It's fascinating. There's a passage here. I just want to, having read the book by Walt Isaacson on Steve, the biography that he worked with Steve closely on. There's one passage here I'm just going to read you here and get your comments, since you know Steve so well. It's very much at the end of the book. He said, Isaacson wrote, at his product launches, Steve Jobs would conclude with a slide projected on the screen behind him of street signs showing the intersection of the liberal arts and technology. At his last such appearance for the iPad 2 in 2011, he stood in front of the image and declared, it's in Apple's DNA that technology alone is not enough, that it's technology married with liberal arts, married with the humanities, that yields us the result that makes our hearts sing. And that's what made him the most creative. And then that's the end of quote. And then Isaacson said that's what made him the most creative technology innovator of our era. You guys probably made that slide. I mean, actually, don't you make the slides like that?
Yeah, no, we didn't make the slide. That was the communications team. But no, that really comes from Steve. That's the way he was. I think really since the beginning of his career. He had a deep appreciation for the arts. He had a deep appreciation for the types of things that made us feel things. He loved music. He loved these things that drove an emotional outcome, that had a spirit to what he was doing. And I think that this approach of finding this balance was fundamentally the way he was wired. And I think most people who I would consider geniuses have this innate ability to use essentially both halves of their brain. And we tend to want to separate humanities versus the sciences, I guess, because we tend to look at things in silos and look at them as almost opposing things. In reality, they're not really opposing things. They need to be developed, in my mind. They're as essential together as I would say. They're more essential together than they would be apart.
And Steve himself, a true genius, marrying those. Did he push that through the whole Apple, you know, ecosystem, the kind of the way you talk about your staffing and the people you look for? Was that a kind of one of the lenses that they were always using in terms of their hiring and how they promoted folks and things?
I think it was probably more the case in his first stint at Apple than maybe in the second stint. Obviously, a lot of the work that was produced in the second round was the most groundbreaking. But I think it was the most groundbreaking really because he brought that perspective himself to the conversation. I think there was a little bit of a little bit more siloing, so there was deeper expertise within the team in the second round, and maybe less kind of lateral knowledge. But I think he tended to put himself in the position of, you know, who are the end users, who are the customers, and really make these things for what he believed to be the right type of product or the right type of solution. As far as the organization goes, you know, obviously he was dealing with scaling and a lot of other aspects to the business that naturally make it more difficult to manage that, you know, at a really large scale. But no, I think it was fundamentally coming from his core belief in the way you think about things.
Now you mentioned other clients, and again, you've been you guys have an amazing kind of client list. But you've worked with Virgin. Have you worked with Branson or others? I mean, are there other? Can you give some examples of that kind of two-brain approach in other contexts too?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, our work with Virgin. You know, Richard Branson represents, I think, another type of individual where, you know, there is really an interesting balance between the left brain and right brain, and you know, if you look, he started in the music industry, so he started in a very emotive kind of business, but was able to move that into a number of other categories, and with great successes. And I think that you know, that the people that you tend to recognize and value are ones that have been able to be successful at bridging some of these qualities. You know, whether it's rational versus emotional. I mean, we've seen, particularly in developing of content and marketing materials and things like this for companies, we've seen the best results when there's both a rational and an emotional component to it. So we tend to not look at it as an either or, but as a way of connecting in the best possible way with people. And I think, you know, whether that is Virgin, whether that is you know, other types of companies that we've worked with that are in completely different types of categories, if we're able to connect at both levels, you have the best opportunity of developing a relationship between a company and their customers.
Now, do you think that's a rare skill for people to have that both, or do you think it's inherent in anybody and it just needs to be brought out, or is it teachable? I'm just kind of curious how you think of that vital characteristic that you're looking for.
I think if you ask you know, Sir Ken Robinson, he would tell you that it's beaten out of us in childhood. But you know, the idea that our education system is still somewhat a product of the industrial revolution. We're still building a lot of minds around fitting into categories, and I think that, you know, developing individuals, you know, creating something that is an experience that's really starting to develop a connection with both sides of the brain. Those I think are the people I've seen who are the most successful. But I think ultimately it's the most successful for our society is if we can build that into a fundamental part of our learning. But the capability is there. We all have two sides of the brain.
I see what you're saying. But I guess I'm curious, in your own professional, because you're working at such a high level too. I mean, is it hard to find the 200 people that you're able to get there, or is this so it's rarer than we need it to be at some level, or is it actually more not as rare? I'm just kind of curious how how difficult is the situation in terms of a guy who's trying to hire for that kind of creativity?
Yeah, I mean, I think we want to look at people who have a comfort with looking at things from an analytical perspective, but also who can feel something and who are comfortable talking about an engagement or a design or a solution by understanding what the human outcome is. And I think if we frame the process and the conversation correctly, everybody, whether they know it or not, they have the ability to be more analytical or to be more emotional. But I think that you can bring that out of a lot of people. Some people more than others. Some people are predisposed to be very, very linear thinkers, and some are very, very lateral thinkers. And I think it's one of the reasons that businesses struggle with working with creative people. Is it's not a linear process. It's not something that you can make more efficient by stacking the blocks straighter. And I think that we try to create an environment where we nurture the growth and the development of people to become more holistic. And the more you have you start with a group of smart people, and you put them together and you put them into an environment where that process can be supported, then you tend to have a better outcome.
Now, you're sitting in Singapore, you're in Asia. I've spent quite a bit of time myself in that region, not literally just Singapore, but the whole Asia. And you've got offices in Europe, and you've got them all over the world. Is there any way you can talk about the cultural basis of that kind of left brain, right brain thing, or which might be rooted in culture, might be rooted in education systems, whatever, but how do the humanities play out, let's just say broadly, in the Asian context there? It's distinct from what you've found in the United States, where you grew up, and that's where you worked for most of your life.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I see in different countries in Asia, and it's true not just in Asia, but I think it's true in many countries. There's kind of a natural culture that develops around the approach to creating things. If you just compare Singapore, which is historically is probably one of the Asia success stories. There's been an incredible focus on, I would say, on sort of developing the sciences and developing the technology and growing a certain consistency among the population. Whereas if you look at say Thailand, where it's maybe a much more creative society, it's had less traditional vertical success because of probably more lateral thought and more contrast and a bit more conflict. So there's really you can point to different countries, but I think that the different cultures tend to balance these things in different ways. I know that in Singapore, there's an emphasis on bringing in much more right brain, much more of the humanities into the conversation, because if you look at being adventurous, being able to think of things holistically, that's a trait that you tend to underdevelop when you're looking at things that are more cautious or more linear. And it's this balance in my mind that you have to work to achieve in order to get the best outcomes.
How we've been hearing this in other ways too, including in mainland China, how there's been a renewed interest in the humanities after so many years of science and tech kind of and also memorization and all kinds of things that are kind of rooted in that kind of Chinese cultural approach to education, and that there is this new interest. So could you tell us a little bit about that? I'm curious on how are they going about that, or how are they actually
Well, I think
Are they investing in it? Are they bringing outsiders in? Are they trying to redesign their educational system? I'm just curious how you think how that's happening, playing out.
yeah, well, we're doing a fair amount of work in China, but I'm not sure I can speak as an authority on the way they're doing it. What I see is that in the rush, China has grown at an incredibly rapid rate, and as a result, um, the the race towards the economic outcome has has overshadowed everything else. And I think that people have experienced incredibly poorly designed cities, incredibly poorly designed lifestyles for the sake of this rapid growth, and it was effectively a gold rush, I would say. Now that the rate of growth has slowed down, they actually have time to stop and consider the types of things that are incredibly important to building a successful culture, a successful civilization, which is you have to start thinking about each other, and you have to start thinking a lot more about the kinds of things that you're creating for a longer term outcome. And I think that there's that what we're seeing in terms of the shift toward humanities there is really rooted in the fact that people are seeing immediately the results of what this race in a very short time to grow the country has produced. And a lot of people are looking at the cities that have developed and in China during the past 10 years and using them as examples of what not to do. And so, when you look at the leadership and the education there, they have to start to develop an appreciation for things other than just the short-term benefits. And I think that's where humanities, they're starting to go back and question the roots of the culture because they feel that they've lost some of that in this race. And I think that you see a lot of places re-examining what are we doing for one another as an outcome of what we're creating. And I think that goes back to kind of earlier where we were talking about the definition of design. But if you're looking at we always describe the work we do as designing human experience. That really goes back to understanding what the human outcome is. And if you look at the education system and the shift that you're describing in China, they're seeing a lot of the product. They're having to live with a lot of the product that was created without, I would say, particularly without much sensitivity to what they were creating. And so I think it's a natural kind of pendulum adjustment that's happening.
It's just funny that here we are in the United States, and the pendulum's the other way. It's like everyone's really talking about, oh, we need more STEM, we need more science and technology, and there's something to that. I mean, we still do need that for sure, but there is a kind of a marginalization now of a lot of resources and things towards the humanities, and it's funny that while we're doing that, the Asian countries are actually who have actually been very intense in that other space are now starting coming back. Any examples actually? Because I think you rightly point out that Singapore is kind of like as such a small country, but it also is kind of very affluent. It's kind of the success story of that kind of cultural expression of that. Any examples or anecdotes or something about how they're trying to now, when they're in this position, they're actually realizing that they kind of need to inject more humanities into things?
Well, I think I think of Singapore as an incredibly well-designed place. That if you think, and I'm not sure how many of your how much of your audience really knows that much about Singapore, but basically Lee Kuan Yew, who was one of the founders of the country, he approached things in much the same way that I would say Steve Jobs or some of these other guys who were success stories in business. He approached the creation of the country in a very similar way. He looked at things in a holistic manner. He thought about yes, the business side and the analytics side. There had to be an economic program in place that was very rational and that made sense. But he also planted 10,000 trees a year, and planting 10,000 trees a year doesn't necessarily sound like a real rational thing to do. but he knew that he had to make Singapore a very livable place, and designing all of the elements with a sense of an outcome. I mean, if you look at Japan as an example, Japan is one of the few countries in the world where when the cherry blossoms bloom, everyone stops working and they go spend 2 days drinking a beer under the cherry tree. This as just a cultural identity is something that starts to show empathy and starts to demonstrate that that's a part of the national language that needs to always be there. And so I think Singapore's always had this trait, but I think it hasn't been really elevated to the level that it will be as we look farther down the line. It's a natural byproduct of confidence, comfort, and success that you start to then you're able to afford the luxury, I guess, of being sensitive in culture.
Now, this evolution of the kind of primacy of design. I mean, your career. I'm roughly in your kind of age bracket there, and there was a time when I was younger that design was not as central to this conversation that's going on as I think it's increasingly become over time. To the point now that all conferences around design. I mean, design is kind of the way everyone sees technology now, is through this prism of design, which did not seem to be. It seems to have its stature has risen over the several decades here. I'm curious if you see that same kind of phenomena, and if you have any thoughts on why that is and where it's going. Does that jive with the way you kind of see things over the last?
Yeah, there's no doubt that design sensitivity has been elevated. When I think obviously many companies, and Apple is probably one of them, where there was a sense that the design is fundamental to what differentiated that company's success from others. And I think there's been a shift towards companies recognizing that the way to distinguish itself is through design. And I think that you could say, and maybe Google is another example. Here is a company that's been very much built around, I would say, much more of the STEM point of view, the engineering point of view, and much less around the design point of view. And yet its most successful products, you would argue the search engine, was probably at its time the most customer-centric product that they ever created, and probably has ever created. But if you look at other search engines at that time, but Google making a single text box and entering anything into it was, technically from an engineering side on the back end, a very strong thing. But it was only successful because it demonstrated that the most accessibility, the most adoption through, I think, a real design success. I don't think that you could say that about maybe many of the other products that Google has produced, because they have been very much skewed towards the engineering side without much emphasis on the humanities side, on the design side. And so we'll see how the car works out. Hopefully it works out better than the Google Glass and some of the other things. But just engineering alone is not enough. Design has elevated itself to the point where you only have an innovation when you have adoption. It's not just about the idea, and it's not just about the technology. And so, from our perspective, we see design has risen quite a bit. I think it's actually starting to become a key differentiator across almost every category of business. In terms of the way we think about our business today, we're structuring our consulting business to ultimately be about one half of the work we do, and the other half of the work we're doing is called design incubation. So we're actually taking on projects and developing projects new business is essentially around a much more human experience perspective. And what we've seen in a lot of startups these days is that there's business ideas. So Uber was created as a business idea. We see people coming in to a solution based on a particular technology, but we think there's a huge space to come at it from human experience perspective. And when we look at most incubators today, they're happy to have a unicorn in 1 in 1,000. If we were to have our consulting business based on that kind of success rate, we would have been out of business a long time ago. So, I think the idea that we can shift the focus and spend at least half of our time, really focusing on incubating the world's next great companies, that gives I think design even a sort of the next tier up from not just being relevant in the conversation, but being important at defining where there's new value that can be created.
When you mentioned Uber, are you doing work with them, or are you doing work with these kind of next round of up and coming apples, or those kind of startups?
We're doing work with companies who are just starting, in addition to the ones who are there. We're not currently working with Uber, but I think that it's that idea that if you come at a problem from another perspective, in this case the human experience as the outcome, that you start to frame the problems differently, and then you look for the business and the technology components that support that experience. And so, from our perspective, I see design as ultimately being a sustainable model, because much of the revenue stream that comes into the business will be coming through the incubation side.
Now, my understanding is you've done work with Tesla as well. Is that right? You've done work with them?
That's right.
So there's another kind of iconic entrepreneur, and now that Steve has passed away, is kind of one of the current generations of wonder kinds. I mean, have you had much exposure to him personally, and Elon Musk, and talk about a little bit about their integration of design, which is obviously with the Tesla and others, primacy on design as well.
Yeah. I mean, we've had a little bit of interaction with Elon, but the thing that I would say about what he is doing is, he's starting to, I think, reframe much of the way we think about the creation of business and the creation of opportunities around much more of the human outcome side of things. So again, going back to the creation of SpaceX, the creation of Tesla, the Hyperloop, and some of these other things that he's working on, those aren't led by a technology first. They're led by what he hopes is a human outcome first, whether that's affecting our planet or being able to change the way we interact. But he has many of the same attributes and many of the same priorities and objectives that I would say others, such as Steve or Richard Branson or others, have had.
So just to kind of bring this back to the world of higher education, which is, again, with our partners at Georgetown, who are underwriting this and been thinking about this. What kind of advice, again, as an outsider, advice for students, who want to be designers and want to be, involved in this process that you're talking about, and want to have the two sides of their brain and want to be working with these next generation technologies? I mean, what are the kinds of things they should be thinking about, engaging in, or studying, or pursuing? And for that matter, from an institutional point of view, what any thoughts on what universities should be thinking about as they kind of really think through what's going to be needed in the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Yeah, well, I think there's probably been, because of the change in the economic environment and a lot of the opportunities that technology has created, there's been maybe a perception that the role that humanities has to play has been eroded. I don't believe that that's the case. I just think it's the perception. But there's very few companies that don't today look at anthropology, or look at language, or look at history, or look at culture, all of these things that the humanity represents. There are very few companies that can afford to ignore that. You know, one of the three cornerstones. Mark Marcullo wrote a piece for Apple very early on, and when the company was just forming, and one of the key things that he had as attributes was that the company had to have empathy. It had to demonstrate empathy, and I don't think that you can develop the skills and the understanding of what that means without having some deeper knowledge into what this has meant in culture. I think many of the conflicts that we see playing out in different parts of the world are fundamentally the result of injustice and lack of empathy and lack of tolerance around different points of view. I think that without a strong humanities core to what we're doing in business and science, it won't matter. We don't have business, and we don't have scientific breakthrough if we don't have a connection to humanity. So, to me, I can't see them as separate things. If I were looking at what universities should be thinking about, from my perspective, it's integrating humanities as broadly as possible into the other programs, so that we're not just developing, again, one part of the brain, but getting people to be as well-rounded in education as possible.
And then, let's say someone does come out of the humanities. How do you layer in that design expertise? I mean, again, it's an amorphous concept. It's not like, oh, I have a design degree per se, although there are some of these. But how do you learn that? Is it through computer design or graphic design? Or, I mean, there's different, like you say, these approaches to it. But do you think increasingly there will be essentially a discipline of design or something that's more kind of generic and universal and applicable in other places? Or any thoughts on the future of design education, actually?
Well, I sit on the board at Art Center College in Pasadena, which is a design school, one of the top design schools probably in the U.S. And there are design programs for people to engage in, but I think that at a higher level, what we're seeing is business schools. INSEAD runs a program where they bring designers to work with business MBAs and run an intersecting program there, where the people who are studying design have an intersection with what are essentially business processes and procedures and outcomes, and likewise people in business seeing where how the designers can bring in a different perspective and to start to invigorate what the opportunities are, basically helping to teach what a creative process is about. And I see more and more that integration happening. It's really interesting to see the outcomes at the business school when the design students and the business schools start to interact. And ultimately, both groups need to be able to work with one another once they graduate. The same thing is true with engineering. We're working on a program for National University of Singapore where we're integrating the design teams with the engineering teams, and they're typically taught in a very structured silo, but by having that kind of cross-discipline interaction, we've created stronger engineers as well as stronger designers. So to me, that integration is really important. Again, with the T-shaped learning, you can have a very deep expertise, whether it's in humanities or whether it's in electrical engineering, but you need that lateral piece to have it really be of value, and those are the people that we always find the most valuable.
Well, I think that's a great place to actually end. It's a terrific interview and really, really informative, and we appreciate you taking the time and actually in this interview, and we'll have this up exposed to many folks, and we'll be doing short pieces out of this as well. So thank you so much for helping us think through the future of humanities here.
Thanks, Peter. Talk to you soon. Thanks.